It started with a shadow. Not the kind that shifts with the sun or flickers past your peripheral vision. This one stayed still. Watching. Waiting. The first time I saw him, I thought I imagined it. Just a dark shape at the edge of the woods, beyond the wire fence that wrapped around the old farmhouse I was now calling home. I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing a chipped mug, and when I looked up through the window, there he was. A dog. Big. Dark. Unmoving. Just staring. I froze, fingers submerged in warm soapy water, heart doing something it hadn't done in weeks, reacting. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I blinked. And he was gone. I moved in 3 weeks ago. Or maybe 4. Time wasn't something I kept track of anymore. After everything that happened, after losing my mother, my job, and, if I'm being honest, most of myself, I needed a place with no questions, no expectations, and no memories carved into every corner. The farmhouse had been sitting vacant for years, tucked into the quiet bend of a forgotten road in rural Maine. The landlady didn't ask why I wanted to rent it on short notice. I think she was just relieved someone was willing to live here. There were no neighbors for miles. Just woods. Wind. Silence. That was what I wanted. Until the shadow came back. It was 3 days after that first sighting. I'd just stepped outside with a basket of laundry, the kind of simple domestic task that made me feel almost human again. The sun was low, draping the field in gold. I looked up, and there he was. At the edge of the property. Right beside the fence. The same dog. Same stance. Same silent stare. He didn't bark. Didn't wag his tail. Didn't move. Just watched. "Hey," I said aloud before I could stop myself. My voice sounded strange in the open air. I hadn't spoken out loud all day. Maybe not even the day before. He tilted his head slightly. I took one step forward. He didn't run. But he didn't come closer either. Eventually, I went back inside. But he stayed. That night, I dreamed of footsteps crunching leaves outside my window. Not fast or threatening. Just steady. Purposeful. When I jolted awake, heart hammering, the first thing I did was pull aside the curtain. The yard was empty. But the gate, which I always left closed, was open just a crack. I didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. After Mom passed, the messages stopped coming. Friends drifted, unsure how to handle someone who was grieving out loud. And I didn't blame them. I wasn't fun to be around. I wasn't even me. I spent most days reading books I didn't finish and wandering through a house that didn't feel like mine. And now, there was a dog. A stranger. At the fence. The next time I saw him, I was out in the garden pulling weeds from beds that hadn't grown vegetables in years. He was closer this time, maybe 10 feet from the fence. Still no barking. Still no movement. I stood, brushed my hands off on my jeans, and tried again. "Are you lost?" No reaction. "You belong to someone?" Still nothing. Just that look. Calm. Steady. Intent. "I don't have food," I said gently. "Or anything, really." I took one step forward. And he vanished into the trees. By the end of the week, I was looking for him. Not out loud. Not deliberately. But every time I passed the window or stepped outside, I scanned the tree line. Waiting for the shape. The eyes. And he always came back. He didn't howl. Didn't beg. Never crossed the fence. But he watched. Like he was waiting. For something. Or maybe, for me. One morning, I woke up to paw prints. They tracked through the dew-covered grass and stopped just outside the front steps. I followed them, barefoot and dazed, down the path and toward the fence. No sign of him. But the gate, again, stood slightly open. I started leaving the gate shut tight every night. Checking it twice. Securing it with a heavy rock. Still, by morning, it would be open. And the paw prints would be back. The weird part? I wasn't scared. I should have been. A stranger dog on my property, watching me sleep, crossing into my space. But there was something in his presence that didn't feel threatening. It felt deliberate. Like he knew something I didn't. One evening, a storm rolled in. Thunder echoed across the fields. Rain slammed the windows. Wind pushed against the walls like it wanted in. I lit candles, wrapped myself in a blanket, and curled up on the old couch in the living room. I didn't plan to sleep, but my eyes grew heavy. Somewhere between waking and dreaming, I heard it. A soft whine. Faint. Wet. Muffled by glass and wind. I sat up. The power was out. The room was dim. And from the back door, I heard it again. A second whine. I walked slowly, candle in hand, heart fluttering like it always did now. I opened the curtain. And there he was. Drenched. Mud-covered. Shivering. His eyes met mine. And for the first time, he moved. One paw lifted. Then the next. He stepped forward, just enough to reach the door. Then he sat. Waiting. I didn't think. I opened the door. He didn't bolt in. Didn't pounce. He walked in slowly, like he didn't want to scare me. Like he understood this was a decision. He stopped a few feet inside, water pooling under him, fur slicked to his ribs. We stared at each other for a long time. Then he lay down. Right in the center of the room. Like he had finally arrived where he was meant to be. I found an old towel and dried him off as best I could. He didn't flinch. Didn't resist. Just let me care for him. When I was done, he curled up beside the couch, head resting on his paws. I watched the storm through the window, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel so alone. He didn't have a collar. No tags. No signs of recent grooming. But somehow, he felt familiar. Not like I'd seen him before. But like I'd needed him before I knew it. That night, I left the back door unlocked. In the morning, he was still there. Still silent. Still watching. Still mine. Or maybe, I was his. The first morning he stayed, I half expected him to be gone. I even prepared myself for it, the soft disappointment of an empty floor, the silence heavier than the storm had been the night before. But he was still there. Curled on the rug by the door. Chest rising and falling in a deep, steady rhythm. One ear twitching with every gust of wind outside. He hadn't moved all night. And when I stepped into the room, barefoot and quiet, he opened his eyes. He didn't get up. He just looked at me. Like he'd been waiting. I didn't know what to do. Should I feed him? Was that some invisible line I shouldn't cross? What if he belonged to someone? What if he wandered back into the woods and someone was out there looking for their dog, heartbroken, posting flyers on telephone poles I couldn't see? But, no collar. No tag. No name. No hesitation. He had chosen this place. Chosen me. I made oatmeal and scrambled eggs. Simple. The only breakfast I could get myself to eat most days. He watched every movement but didn't beg, didn't whine, didn't inch closer. He waited. Only when I placed a small bowl of eggs near the fireplace did he move. He padded forward, ate quietly, neatly. Then sat down again, like he wasn't here to take, only to stay. Guess that makes two of us, I muttered. He blinked once. And it felt like a conversation. I started calling him Shadow. It felt right. He moved like one, silent, smooth, always there just on the edge of vision, never startling but never far. I didn't say the name out loud at first. Just in my head. But eventually, it slipped out. Shadow," I said one afternoon as he stood by the porch steps, ears pricked toward the trees. He turned his head. Looked at me. "And that was it," he answered. The next few days blurred into one another. He followed me everywhere, but never in an intrusive way. If I walked into the kitchen, he lay nearby. If I read on the couch, he positioned himself between me and the door. If I cried, and I did, more than once, he pressed his head against my arm without a sound. He never asked for attention. But he always offered it. Like he knew the weight I carried, and knew how to share it. On the fourth night, I had a nightmare. Not the kind with monsters or fire or falling. Just, Mom. She was there, sitting at the kitchen table like she used to. Laughing. Warm. Whole. The light behind her was golden, and for a second, I believed it. That she wasn't gone. That this wasn't all just echoes. But when I walked toward her, she faded. Like mist. And I woke up with a broken sob trapped in my throat. I didn't have to reach for comfort. Shadow was already there. Not on the rug. Not beside the bed. But curled against me. Half his body on top of the blanket, his head pressed gently to my ribs. Still. Watching. Like he'd known. Like he'd felt the moment my dreams began to hurt. I didn't move. Didn't speak. I just laid a hand on his back and felt him breathe. And slowly, I fell asleep again. The next morning, something changed. He followed me out to the mailbox. That might not seem like much, but until then, he hadn't crossed the porch without me, never stepped beyond the garden, never wandered into the field. But this time, he walked with purpose. To the end of the drive. To the broken, rusted mailbox standing crooked on its post. I opened it, nothing inside, and turned back. That's when I noticed, Shadow wasn't looking at me. He was looking into the trees. I followed his gaze. Dense woods. Brown, mossy trunks. No path, no trail. Just forest. I squinted, half expecting to see another dog. A deer. A person. Nothing. Just trees. But his ears twitched. His muscles tensed. And then, just as suddenly, he turned away. And walked back to the house. That night, I sat on the porch steps while Shadow lay beside me. I stared out at the fence, now repaired, the gate latched tight. The stars above blinked through clouds, the air sharp and quiet. "Do you know this place?" I asked softly. He didn't respond. Just breathed. The next day, I drove into town for supplies. It was the first time I'd left the house since he arrived. When I returned, Shadow was waiting. Right at the fence line. Not inside. But at the line. Just sitting. Watching. When I opened the gate, he didn't rush forward. He waited for me to call him in. I knelt down. "Come on, Shadow. It's okay." He patted forward and sat at my feet. And for the first time, I realized something. He wasn't just a stray who found a home. He was choosing me. Every single day. Later that evening, I tried something. I picked up the old tennis ball that had been left behind in the barn, probably by the last tenant's dog, years ago. I rolled it between my palms, then walked out into the yard. Shadow followed. I held the ball up. "Wanna play?" I asked, uncertain. I tossed it gently across the grass. He didn't chase it. Instead, he turned his head slightly, watching it roll away. Then looked back at me. Like the game wasn't important. Like being here was the point. I sat down in the grass, suddenly overwhelmed by a wave of grief so strong it stole the breath from my lungs. I hadn't let myself feel like this in weeks. Maybe longer. I'd kept it all bottled, hidden behind chores and old books and silence. But now it came crashing through. I covered my face with both hands and shook with it. And then, there he was. Beside me. No whining. No licking. Just his head on my knee. Just his presence. Steady. Still. Real. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because something inside me had begun to shift. The weight I carried was no longer mine alone. It had been noticed. Acknowledged. Shared. I found myself talking to Shadow more. Not full conversations, not yet. But little things. Soft things. Things I didn't even realize I was holding inside until they slipped out. I think I miss who I used to be. I don't know if I'm getting better or just getting quieter. She loved dogs. My mom. She would have adored you. He never responded. But he always listened. And somehow, that was enough. That weekend, I found a trail in the woods behind the house. An old, overgrown path nearly hidden under pine needles and thorny vines. I wouldn't have noticed it, but Shadow led me there. He stood at the tree line, looked back, and then stepped inside. I hesitated. Then followed. We walked for nearly 20 minutes, deeper and deeper, until the trees began to open up into a quiet, circular clearing. At the center, a stone marker. Worn. Cracked. Barely legible. But I could make out 3 letters. EMC. I turned to Shadow. He was sitting already. Looking at the stone. Still. Silent. Like he'd been there before. Like he'd been waiting to bring me. I sat beside him and stared at the marker. And suddenly, the way he always watched the woods, the way he respected the fence, the way he waited for me to call him. It all made sense. This wasn't my story. Not entirely. It was his too. And now, we were writing the rest together. There are moments in life when silence speaks louder than words ever could. That clearing in the woods, the one Shadow had led me to, was one of them. I didn't know whose initials were carved into the stone. Didn't know what it marked, didn't know how long it had been there. But Shadow knew. He sat beside it like it was sacred. Like it mattered. And somehow, I knew better than to speak. After that day, Shadow changed. Not in a way most people would notice. He still followed me everywhere, still lay silently beside my chair while I read, still came to my side the second I stirred in bed. But he was more deliberate. Every glance felt like a message, every pause in the hallway, every alert ear in the middle of the night, like pieces of a puzzle he was trying to show me. And I was finally ready to see it. I started researching. Not because I needed to know, but because I wanted to. Something in me had shifted. Shadow wasn't just a wandering stray. He wasn't just a comfort during a difficult time. He was here for a reason. Maybe he'd always been. I began with local records. I drove into town and visited the tiny library, the kind that still used a card catalog and smelled like time. Looking for anything specific? The librarian asked. I hesitated. A woman, I said finally. Someone who might have lived out near the old Rayner property. Maybe 5, 6 years ago. I found a marker in the woods. EMC. The librarian tapped her chin. EMC, that rings a bell. Hold on. She disappeared behind a shelf. A few minutes later, she returned with a dusty binder. This is a collection of old news clippings and incident reports from the area. Local stuff. Not always digitized. She placed it in front of me. And I opened it. It didn't take long. About halfway through, I found it. A short column. Just a few inches wide. Missing local woman feared lost in forest. Eliza May Cartwright, 34, was last seen walking her dog near the trails behind her home east of Rayner Hollow. Neighbors reported her missing after she failed to return calls and was not seen for 2 days. Authorities conducted a 2-week search but found no trace. Her dog, a large mixed breed, was also missing. No foul play was suspected. The family declined interviews. The article was dated 6 years ago. I stared at it. Then at Shadow, lying at my feet. Eyes open. Watching me. "Eliza," I whispered. He blinked slowly. It wasn't a confirmation, not exactly. But I felt it. The way he carried himself. The way he stood at that marker. The way he waited by the fence all those days before he stepped into the house. He hadn't just stumbled onto my land. He'd come back. I found more in the binder. Handwritten notes from neighbors, reports from local rangers. One of them mentioned that the search dogs had refused to cross the creek near the ridge trail. Another said Eliza had been an avid hiker, but quiet, kept to herself, always walking with that dog of hers. A second article listed him as large black mutt, no collar. Shadow. He had waited. For 6 years. When I drove home that evening, I pulled into the driveway slower than usual. The house looked different. Not physically. The porch was still crooked, the roof still sagged a little over the kitchen window. But it didn't feel like a place of escape anymore. It felt like a home. And someone else had helped build that. Shadow stood at the edge of the garden when I stepped out of the car. I held up the folder from the library. "I found her," I said gently. He didn't move. But something in his posture softened. I knelt down. "She's gone, isn't she?" He closed the distance and rested his head against my shoulder. And just like that, the truth settled in. He hadn't come here to be found. He had come here to finish something. The days that followed were peaceful in a way I hadn't known in years. I worked in the garden, clearing dead roots and planting new ones. Shadow followed me into the barn, curling up while I organized the old tools and patched the broken window. At night, I read aloud to him, novels, poetry, old letters I'd written to my mom and never mailed. He never flinched. Never turned away. Just listened. Like Eliza must have done. Like Mom used to. And I began to heal. Not quickly. Not neatly. But every day, a little more. Shadow wasn't a therapist. He couldn't fix me. But he was present. And that made all the difference. One morning, I woke up early and couldn't find him. Panic rose in my chest before I'd even thrown the blankets aside. I ran to the kitchen. The yard. The barn. Nothing. And then I saw the open gate. Heart pounding, I followed the tracks, soft prints in the morning dew, through the grass, into the woods. Down the overgrown trail we'd walked together. Back to the clearing. There he was. Standing in front of the stone. Still. Silent. When he turned to me, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't before. Relief. I walked to his side and crouched down. "I think she'd be proud of you," I said. His ears twitched. "She must have loved you a lot." He pressed his head to my leg. And for the first time, I realized what he'd done. He hadn't just waited. He hadn't just watched. He had carried her memory forward. All the way to me. Later that afternoon, I carved a new marker, a second stone. Just beneath the initials EMC, I placed it. It simply read. Shadow kept watch. No dates. No details. But it was enough. That night, as I curled into bed, Shadow climbed up beside me, something he'd never done before. He stretched out slowly, head resting against my ribs, his breath sinking with mine. And as I drifted toward sleep, I whispered, "I'm not alone anymore." And somewhere in the dark, I swear I heard it. A long brie. E initials. The way Shadow sat beside it like a soldier keeping watch. She hadn't vanished. She'd been found by the only one who refused to stop looking. That morning, I called the sheriff's department. I didn't plan to. I didn't even know what I'd say. But as I stared out the window at Shadow lying near the gate, head up, always alert, I realized it wasn't about solving a mystery anymore. It was about honoring the truth. Sheriff Daniels speaking. Hi, I said. My name is Elena Monroe. I live out near Rainer Hollow. I think I may have found something, or someone. They arrived an hour later. 2 deputies, both older, polite but skeptical. I led them into the woods, down the trail Shadow had shown me. He walked ahead of us, confident, calm. When we stepped into the clearing, one of the men inhaled sharply. The stone stood just as I'd found it. Weathered. Quiet. But unmistakable. The other deputy crouched beside it, brushing away fallen leaves. EMC, he read aloud. We always hoped we were wrong. Never found a single thing during the search. Her name was Eliza, I said quietly. They nodded. And then one of them looked at Shadow. His eyes widened. That dog. The second deputy squinted. You recognize him? He crouched lower. I think I do. From one of the original search flyers. He was hers, wasn't he? I didn't need to answer. Shadow stepped forward and gently nudged the man's hand. Not fearfully. Just with familiarity. Like he remembered. The deputies took photographs. Promised to run a DNA match with Eliza's remaining family. Promised to update the case. But I could tell, they already believed me. The way Shadow moved through the trees. The way he stood at the stone. The way he stayed just behind me, always watching, never intruding. He was still guarding her. Even now. After they left, I sat on the porch with Shadow by my feet and stared into the woods. Everything had changed. And nothing had. He was still here. Still silent. Still steady. But now I knew who he had been before. And that made his choice to stay mean even more. I went back into the old folder from the library. Found an article about Eliza's family. Her parents had passed. No siblings. Just one aunt in Vermont, and she had declined all interviews. No one had come for Shadow. No one had claimed him. And still, he had never left. That night, I lit a candle in the clearing. A small one. Nothing dramatic. Just a flickering light to say, "You're not forgotten." Shadow sat beside me. When I whispered Eliza's name, he shifted just slightly, head tilted toward the trees, like he was listening for a voice he hadn't heard in years. And when I blew the candle out, I felt something lift. Like a held breath finally released. Back at the house, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in months. Inside was Mom's journal. The one I couldn't bring myself to read after she died. I thought it would hurt too much. That the words would break something fragile I was still holding together. But now, with Shadow curled beside my feet, I opened it. Page after page of memories. Recipes. Quotes. Tiny, thoughtful lines like, "Loss doesn't empty you. It opens space for something new. A quiet life isn't a lonely one. If a dog chooses you, don't question it. That's grace." I smiled, tears in my eyes. She would have loved Shadow. She would have called him a gentleman. The next few days were slow, peaceful. We slipped into a rhythm that felt natural, like we'd been doing it for years. I'd wake up to the soft patting of paws on wood. Shadow would meet me in the hallway, eyes bright, tail wagging just once, a small, silent greeting. We'd walk the edge of the woods together. He'd stop now and then, sniffing the air, ears perked. I began to wonder if he could still feel her. Eliza. Or maybe, now that he had me, he didn't need to. One afternoon, a man from the town shelter came by. One of the deputies had called in a favor. They wanted to scan Shadow for a microchip, just in case. I agreed, but my stomach twisted as the truck pulled into the drive. What if they found something? What if someone came to claim him? What if this whole fragile new life I'd built around him suddenly slipped through my fingers? The man was kind. Careful. Shadow let him approach without resistance. The scanner beeped once. Then stopped. The man looked up and shook his head. No chip. Relief crashed over me so hard I nearly dropped to the porch. Shadow watched me. Eyes soft. Like he knew I'd been holding my breath. And like he was glad to stay. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table and opened a fresh journal. On the first page, I wrote. He wasn't just a lost dog. He was someone's memory. Someone's guardian. Someone's heart. And when she was gone, he waited. He watched. He chose. He knew I was alone, and he took his chance. I didn't cry writing it. Not this time. Because now, the tears weren't grief. They were gratitude. The next morning, I woke to rain. Steady, gentle, tapping on the roof like a lullaby in reverse. I stepped out onto the porch, barefoot, coffee in hand. Shadow was already there, lying just at the edge, watching the woods like always. But this time, when I sat beside him and looked out at the trees, I didn't see the past. I saw possibility. A future I hadn't imagined in a long time. Because sometimes, healing doesn't walk through the door. Sometimes, it waits at the fence. Patient. Quiet. And when it knows the time is right, it takes its chance. The sky that night was darker than usual. Not storm dark, just that heavy, suffocating blackness that comes when the moon is missing and the stars decide not to show up. The kind of night where even the trees seem to hold their breath. Shadow felt it first. We were curled up on the couch, me with a book, him lying at my feet, when he lifted his head and stared toward the window. Not the soft, curious glance of a dog hearing a squirrel. But focused. Frozen. His ears were forward. His body stiff. And that low, unmistakable growl, the one I hadn't heard since the night of the storm, rose deep from his chest. I set the book down. What is it? He didn't answer, of course. Just stood slowly and stepped toward the front door. I followed. My heart thudded. The air felt wrong. Charged. Like we weren't alone anymore. I flipped the porch light on. Nothing. Then I opened the door. Still, nothing. Just the wind in the grass and the hum of the woods. I started to step outside, and that's when Shadow moved. He leapt in front of me. Blocked the door. His body pressed hard against my legs, pushing me back inside. Shadow. He didn't growl. Didn't bark. But he stared up at me with that same expression I'd seen once before, the night he lay on top of me, silently willing me to wake up. Not warning. Not panic. Protection. I shut the door. Latched it. Turned all the locks. Then I did something I hadn't done since moving in. I checked every window. Every room. And in the back of the house, near the laundry room, I found it. The side window was cracked open. I never left it that way. Never. My stomach dropped. Shadow was already there, standing by the hallway, tail still, ears alert. I crouched beside him. You knew, I whispered. You felt it. He pressed his head gently into my shoulder. Then pulled away, walking to the window and sitting. Waiting. I called the sheriff, hands shaking. Told him I thought someone had tried to break in. He said he'd send a car. 30 minutes, maybe more. I stayed by the window. Shadow never moved. And then, around 10 minutes later, we heard it. Footsteps. On the gravel. Not hurried. Not stealthy. Just wrong. Like whoever it was didn't care if I heard them. My hands went cold. I backed away from the window and grabbed the fireplace poker. Shadow pressed closer to the door. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then. A knock. I didn't answer. Didn't speak. And then, without warning, the knob turned. Once. Twice. Locked. But the message was clear. Someone was out there. And they wanted in. Shadow barked, loud, sharp, forceful. A sound that didn't just say stay away, but I will stop you. I'd never heard him like that. He stood tall now, every muscle taut, planted between me and the door. A wall. A shield. A guardian. And whoever was on the other side? They paused. Then ran. Fast. Through the yard. Into the woods. Gone. I collapsed to the floor, shaking. Shadow came to my side, pressing into me so hard I almost fell over. I held him tight. And whispered, "You did it. You protected me." He licked my hand once. Then sat beside me. Still watching the door. Just in case. The police arrived 15 minutes later. Flashlights scanned the yard. A few footprints in the grass, some broken twigs. Nothing to follow. No suspect. No face. Just one thing that mattered. I was safe. Because Shadow had taken his chance. And claimed this place as his. Claimed me as his. The next morning, I didn't sleep in. I brewed strong coffee, fed Shadow extra, and sat with him on the porch as the sun rose over the trees. He was calm again now. Back to his usual silent strength. I looked down at him. "I never asked why you stayed." He turned his head slightly. "I never asked what you lost. Or how you waited all that time." I paused. "But I think I know now." He blinked once. I reached down and ran my fingers through the thick fur on his back. "You were waiting for someone who needed you just as badly as you needed them." His tail swept the porch floor once. That day, I returned to the clearing. The candle I had left there weeks before had long since melted away. But the memory remained. I knelt in front of Eliza's stone and traced the initials. "Thank you," I whispered. "For loving him. For teaching him how to love." Shadow sat beside me, just like always. And as the wind passed through the trees, I felt something shift, something small and light and quiet. A sense of peace. Back at the house, I took down the empty frame that had been hanging in the hallway. It had been blank since I moved in. I never found a picture worth placing there. But now, I knew what belonged. I printed out the photo I'd taken 2 weeks ago, Shadow curled on the porch in the afternoon sun, head high, body relaxed, the woods behind him. I placed it in the frame. And underneath, I wrote one sentence. He knew I was alone, and he took his chance. Time passed. Not fast. Not slow. Just forward. And Shadow remained. He never strayed far. Never wandered from the trail. He watched the woods, the house, me, with a gaze that always knew more than I could explain. And I never asked him to stop. Because I'd stopped wanting to be alone. One night, months later, I woke to the sound of rain. Soft, steady, familiar. Shadow was curled beside my bed, his breathing even. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel fear in the darkness. I felt seen. Protected. Loved. Without words. Without conditions. Just presence. I slipped a hand down, rested it on his head. He opened one eye. And in that gaze, I saw everything he had carried. Everything he had given. Everything he had become. Not a stray. Not a visitor. Not someone else's memory. But mine. Because when I was at my lowest. When the world was silent. When the house was empty and the nights too long. He knew. And he took his chance.